Hello, I'm Dan Tillapaugh, and you can use he, him, his pronouns for me. I am an assistant professor of counselor education at California Lutheran University. Today, we have a terrific group of educational scholars who will be sharing their thoughts with us on quantitative research methods. I'll ask them to introduce themselves in just a minute, but before they do, I want to send a shout out to Dr. Chris Linder from the University of Georgia, who inspired this idea of these recorded panel discussions about educational research. I also want to thank my collaborator on this series, Dr. Jessica Harris from UCLA, who helped prepare the questions for today's panel and who will be serving as a co-moderator with me. Today's panelists will be discussing their experiences as researchers engaged in quantitative research methods in educational contexts. Their work is really interesting, it's insightful, and it is very innovative and cutting edge. And I'm so pleased that they're able to share their insights with us today. At this point, I'm going to ask them to introduce themselves briefly with their name, gender pronouns, a little bit about themselves and what they do as researchers. And I'm actually going to ask my co-moderator, Dr. Harris, to start us off.
Thank you, Dan. My name is Jessica Harris. I'm an assistant professor in higher education and organizational change at UCLA. Please use she, her, hers pronouns. My research focuses on really broadly race and racism on the college campus, but two research agendas or two research strands animate that. More broad topic of race and racism. The first is multiraciality on the college campus, so focusing on multiracial students, faculty, and student affairs professionals. And then that second vein or strand that animates my research agenda focuses on sexual violence, specifically as it relates to women of color survivors of campus sexual violence. And I am more of a qualitative researcher, so I look forward to learning a bit more about quantitative today.
Hello, everyone. My name is John Dugan, and my pronouns are he, him, his. I am a professor at Loyola University Chicago, where I teach in our higher education graduate program. I am, I would say, a reluctant quantitative researcher who got into it mostly out of distress from how it was being taught and to understand better what was not being taught well. And I have two major areas of inquiry. So both are around the concept of leadership as a pro-social vehicle for social justice. The multi-institutional study of leadership is my quantitative study. We collect data at about 300 colleges and universities across 7 countries, looking at how higher education shapes or constrains human capacity building. And then I have a qualitative research project that's a critical hermeneutic phenomenology, looking at the ways individuals deeply integrate their identities into leadership for social change.
Hi, everybody. My name is Garvey. I use he, him, his pronouns. Super excited to be here. I'm an assistant professor of higher education and student affairs at the University of Vermont. And I proudly identify as a quantitative queer, which has meaning both methodologically and personally. I broadly study the experiences and outcomes of queer and trans students in higher education. And then another line of inquiry of mine is methodological decisions with survey design and quantitative analyses that are progressive and identity affirming across, in particular, gender and sexuality.
Thank you, everyone. So our first question for you today is, how would you explain quantitative research to a student who may not be familiar with what exactly quantitative research is?
Go for it,
You want to start with that one, or you want me to?
I can go first. I have a simple answer that I think kind of captures it. When I discuss quantitative inquiry, I say I narrate the student experiences numerically. So I see myself as a storyteller that weaves together numbers to have a broad impact.
I love that. I think I'm just going to go ahead and steal that and give you credit for it every time I have to explain it. I think it's beautiful. I love it. I usually start by saying that, for me, part of it is when you say the word quantitative, it immediately elicits a reaction. I know it does for me, of math and statistics in a dehumanization process. So I usually start by trying to demystify what quantitative research is, and similarly suggests that it's a way of numerically looking at experiences, learning, how people navigate or make meaning of the world. I talk about the limitations, and I typically nest quantitative research as an artifact of the power structure of what we consider truth in academia, and really push students to think about the power structure often makes it inaccessible by design. And so for those of us who care about social justice, there's an obligation to deconstruct and disrupt that. And there's very clear tools and ways to do that.
That's great.
Thank you.
So our next question is really, we're interested in understanding what drew you to engaging in quantitative research. And even from the start of your introductions, I think that both of you have some maybe divergent sort of stories here. So I'm fascinated in hearing. So maybe Jay, if you want to start with this answer, and then we'll move to John.
Sure. Well, it may come through in this question response that John and I are both proud Terps and Maryland graduates. So I credit a lot of my methodological interest to faculty at the University of Maryland, both in the college student personnel program and in the method side of the College of Education. When I started, my mentor was Karen Inkelis, and she looped me into the National Study of Living Learning Programs, which was a study that was done in the early 2000s and later carried on through with Matt Mayhew at Ohio State. And I had such specific questions about queer and trans people, and quickly discovered that there were few national survey instruments at the time. I was a student from 2008 through in my doc program. There were very few national data sets and no federal data sets that examined queer and trans students in higher education. I put it on myself not only to become proficient in quantitative methodologies, but also in survey design and survey construction, which later led me to my dissertation in constructing an instrument that measures queer and trans student experiences. As a queer person myself, there were very few representations of queer quantitative work beyond my dear mentor, Sue Rankin. And so I really felt it was empowering for my queer kin to take an additional methodological approach to exploring queer and trans student outcomes.
So for me, I would say, similarly, I have to give a lot of credit to the University of Maryland and the variety of professors that we had there, both in good and also in maybe difficult ways, though. So I went through the master's program there and left having only had exposure to quantitative research, and found myself in a full-time professional position, not fully understanding how to do it because of how it was taught methodologically, how it was taught statistically, and feeling at the time by the institution I was working like that was the valid way to demonstrate impact, and having to very quickly learn and catch up. At the same time, I was sort of struggling with what is left out of quantitative research, and so what voices aren't present, what gets washed out, and not wanting this to be sort of the litmus test for decision making at the institution I was at. When I went back from my doc program, I had a very similar experience, I think, to Jay, where Susan Comavez in particular, as we launched the multi-institutional study of leadership, said something I'll never forget, which is, if we were studying social change, we have to model in the design and in implementation of our research the very values that we're attempting to understand. And that simple statement, that meant the survey design was radically altered. And so at the time, we were one of the first studies to actually include indicators around ability status, around religion, differentiating race and ethnicity, asking about trans identification, asking about sexual identification, and trying to model, imperfectly to be candid at times, but model that. And part of what I also learned through that process was the power, when you reclaim quantitative research, that it opens up different layers of capital. Whether it should or should not, it does. And so when you can tap into that, you can actually use it to disrupt systems. And so, again, I'm a really reluctant quantitative researcher. They're not the questions that motivate me, but I see the power of having to understand the system to change it. And that quantitative knowledge really helps with it.
Thank you. So I'm going to skip this next question because you kind of answered it, and John, you are segueing into the one below it. So I'm wondering, so scholars often believe that your research questions should be the thing that inform your methods, right? So using quant or qual mixed methods, and not the other way around. And so I want to know what your reactions and beliefs to that are. I mean, and John, you just said it, right? Where you don't necessarily want to be using quant or you're reluctant to it. So why don't you start out, say a little bit more about that?
Sure. So, I mean, I think for me, I am absolutely a reluctant and quantitative researcher. And I think something that is really important is I think we can create this privileged system around quantitative research if someone gets it or they don't get it. And those who get it, it comes with ease and facility. And the reality is every time I have to run a statistic, I have to reteach myself. Every time I have to think of how I want to do an analysis, I'm stopping and starting over. And I have colleagues who that's not the case for them. And I don't know where you fall on the spectrum, Jay, but you know, my good colleague, Mark Emberg, is one of the most brilliant quantitative researchers I've ever met. I mean, he is just fabulous in how he understands it. For me, it takes a lot more work. So I've had to be comfortable knowing that it's going to be a lot more blood, sweat, and tears in trying to actually do it. What I would say, Jessica, is that for me, when I'm really, you know, that whole, does the question precede the analysis or not? The questions I more inherently ask are qualitative questions. But oftentimes where I start is more from a pracademic space where I'm like, how do I influence change in this place? And then I work backwards from that. And sometimes by working backwards, it leads to a quantitative question. And sometimes by working backwards, it's a qualitative question. Sometimes it's mixed methods. But for me, I think that's part of my orientation as a critical learner and a critical researcher, is that action piece is most important to me. And so I usually let that direct how I think about the questions and the type of methods I then employ.
There's so many layers to this question. It's really making my mind stir so much. The first I will say is that a lot of the questions I have of the universe are usually quantitative if we're creating a dichotomy between qual and quant inquiry. However, with that being said, I think that my methodological expertise, or what I would rather to say my methodological limitations within quant methods, do guide the questions that I ask. In other words, I am starting to learn how to use structural equation modeling. So to understand the complex relationships between latent constructs and other variables is hard for me right now. However, I really understand how to do tests of differences and relationships. So regression analyses and ANOVAs, for example, those questions roll off my tongue quite easily. So the limitations of my quantitative expertise do greatly shape the research questions I ask. However, in my head, I often ask myself broad questions about trends and experiences and what related questions rather than meaning making and why related questions. So I often am drawn to large trends in data. The other thought that I'm having is that the data set that I'm using for my analyses greatly shapes the variables that I conclude in any study, which is particularly salient for me as a queer and trans researcher, because up until a few years ago, for example, the National Survey of Student Engagement or any of Harry's data did not include queer or sexuality or trans identifiers. So I was kind of limited in partnering with any of those scholars on asking those broad nationally representative questions until they both did introduce those questions in 2015.
Thank you. I'm going to have to take a quant course with both of you. Just warning you.
You know, here's the thing that I think is important. Quant research can actually be fun. So I think it was maybe 5 quant classes before I had this amazing professor, Dr. Hancock at University of Maryland.
Yes.
Right? And so I was like, I hate this. I remember asking questions and having a professor say, well, I would explain the answer, but you wouldn't understand it. And to me, that was emblematic of the power structure. So if you know, the problem there is really you don't know how to teach it. But what the transference is you will never learn how to understand this, and then you can't interrogate what's missing, what's wrong. So all of these aggregated data sets where really what it is hegemonic whiteness that we're studying, or masculinity, or maleness, however it's described, and if we don't deconstruct that and don't know how to ask the questions, you can never unpack any of it. And so it wasn't until Dr. Hancock, who came in and brought like soda cans and pizza, and helped us really understand what was living behind statistics, that I was like, wow, you can actually use this to really actually effectuate change from a critical quant perspective. And I think that's part of the problem, is we get so trained that quantitative research is scary, too difficult to understand, and simply not fun. And we laughed a ton. And, you know, that's what I think I try and do is try and make it accessible as much as possible, so that more people's eyes, more people's great thinking can be applied to quantitative methods.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, that's really helpful. I continue to only have the scary experience. So, hey, Dr. Hancock. So, Jay, one of the things that in your answer, you know, you started to sort of go into sort of talking about, I think, structural equation modeling and ANOVAs. And so can you maybe explain, like, as briefly as possible, like the distinctions between those things, right? So like, can you just unpack that for students a little bit more?
Yes, of course, I'm happy to. And for those watching who are new to statistics, I often talk about 3 different buckets that can help achieve different types of questions. So the first bucket that I would describe are tests of differences. And those are typically t-tests or ANOVAs, and ANOVA stands for analysis of variance. And then you get into different types of analyses of variance, like analyses with covariances, which is ANCOVAs, or multiple analyses of variance, which is MANOVA, or multiple analyses of covariance, which is MANCOVA, which is incidentally my drag name should I ever decide to use it.
Jay, we are kindred spirits. I said my drag name would always be Mancova Jones.
So mark that. John and I, you will see us at Cabaret.
I am like so excited now. You have no idea. You just made my day.
Oh, it's the Mancova
Your drag family.
The Mancova sisters. I love it. Yeah.
Oh, we could do something really fun, Jay.
Do you remember that song, Sisters?
Yes, we could do that.
Oh, gosh. Okay.
I have dreams of glittering up my beard.
Yes, all of that.
Who knew this wonderful session would spark an entire entertainment act?
Also, this will be the most unique quant webinar that folks have ever seen before, so welcome. So one of the 3 buckets is test of differences, where you can explore differences between groups, and that's typically with t-tests and ANOVAs. Another is tests of relationships, and that is exploring the relationships between different variables, and that's typically correlation analyses or linear regression. And then, of course, is the 3rd bucket, which is tests of probabilities, where you often use chi-square analyses and logistic regression, and those help us explore the likelihood of an event happening or not happening. So for those of you who are beginning with statistics, consider 3 large main buckets: tests of differences, tests of relationships, and tests of probabilities. Now, truth be told, there are other buckets when you get into more sophisticated analyses, and those buckets that I described become a little more refined, but that's a great introductory approach to it all, I think.
That's helpful. Thank you. You know, some of your answers have started to move us into the next question. And so could you sort of talk about how you've crafted a research question and why your chosen methodology helped you answer that specific question? And John, maybe we can start with you.
Sure. So I think, Jay's analogy is really a good one because those are pretty distinct buckets of what you might ask. And then it helps you refine what statistics are you going to use. A lot of my questions are those difference questions as well, because I want to understand when we disaggregate large data sets, does one size truly fit all? And usually the answer is no. And so, for example, we have a manuscript that we are finishing up right now. And maybe I'll use two manuscripts to illustrate the different buckets. So we're looking at this concept of resiliency, not as responsibility of individual, but as coping mechanism to overcome barriers and individual agency. And we're asking questions about to what extent is the responsibility for that displaced on students versus the system and institutions. So one question we're asking is what predicts increased resiliency among college students? And for that, we want to look at, are there differences by race? Are there differences by gender? Are there differences by sexual orientation? Or are there differences because of the interaction of those things? And so we would really use difference testing. We would probably do multiple regression analyses, which is what we've done, to look at then for each unique group, what are those predictors? And to identify, okay, well, in the case of the, resilience for, let's say, African-American students, here are 3 things that matter. We also are really interested at the same time of what's the relationship between resilience, agency, efficacy, and the capacity to engage in socially responsible leadership. Does one influence another? Are they interrelated? Are they overlapping? And so Jay has alluded to structural equation modeling. And so we're using structural equation modeling to look at how do these things interact with one another that leads to someone behaviorally enacting pro-social, social justice behaviors. And so I like to think of structural equation modeling as correlations on steroids. They just really help us to understand and partial out the error to look at it. So I think to backtrack here, for me, again, the question is, what do I want to change? I want to change how the institutions and structures often displace responsibility for resilience on individuals as if they either have it or don't, as a deficit or an asset, to say we should and ought to be doing something to promote this developmental construct. So I want to know how that looks for different populations as a difference question. And then I also want to know as a construct itself, how does resilience relate to these other developmental concepts? Does that help?
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to talk about a concept that's often a dirty word in quantitative inquiry, which is epistemology. And it isn't something, or the way I approach the world and truth, and it isn't something that's often talked about in quant analyses. And so in addition to my methodology helping me refine my question, the way I view truth and the population that I'm studying also shapes the question. So I often use different techniques to try to have a community-centered, person-centered approach. And oftentimes, I try not to compare dominant with historically marginalized populations because it creates a deficit-based approach and creates a deficit-based narrative. Now, I will also create the caveat by saying I think there is critical power with deficit-based approaches to advocate for resources and more inclusive progressive policies. So for those of you out there who study identity-based communities and populations, there is worth in being adaptive with quantitative methods rather than dismissive of the limitations of quant methods. And I often try to find ways of having the most representative voice for the research that I'm conducting. So for example, I just presented a study with my friends Steve Mobley, Kiara Somerville, and Gretchen Moore at the University of Alabama, where we explored queer and trans people of color and their experiences of outness. Rather than comparing QT students to white queer and trans students, we selected all queer and trans students of color from our data set and only analyzed their experiences. Rather than creating a deficit comparative approach, we looked exclusively at the narratives and experiences of those students themselves.
So here's something this is so important if you're listening. I don't think you can stress what Jay is saying enough. And part of, I think, how oftentimes training happens around quantitative is that you ought not to do that. And even as academics, it's hard for us. So we just had a manuscript that was around resilience that we submitted that was looking at race. And we didn't include white students in that analysis, and the feedback from reviewers was, where are the white students?
Yes.
Like, everywhere! Everywhere! This isn't about them, right? And so I think I just want to like put an exclamation point on what Jay said, and there's a re-education process around all of this that I think is really powerful when people do what Jay and his colleagues are doing.
Yes, yes, yes. I would echo the same thing, John. I've had 2 major grant proposals rejected because I didn't have a comparative sample of heterosexual and cisgender students. And it's really a moment of truth-seeking to say, can I compromise my integrity enough as a queer researcher to say, yes, for the purposes of acquiring finances to do this research, I will compare queer students to hetero students.
Yep.
Or is there a point when you say, it's just not the narrative that I need to share with the world? And it can become really difficult. And the other thing is, I was told constantly that I always had to have a comparative sample throughout graduate school, which is why, 1, I created my own data set of just queer and trans people. And 2, why there is such a homogenization of quantitative researchers, because people who are doing identity-based research become so disenfranchised by the education around quant methods that they decide that it is not something that would benefit their community and their research agenda. And so I think when we have more culturally inclusive and community responsive quantitative methods, we'll see more people of color, we'll see more trans and queer folk, we'll see more students with disabilities, more undocumented students wanting to engage in quantitative inquiry because it benefits their own personhood and their community.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I love this conversation. Love you all. Have you read Christine Stanley's 2007 piece, When Counter Narratives Meet Master Narratives?
No, but I
will send it to you directly. It's already open on my desktop.
Yes.
But it basically, so she's a CRT and she's a qualitative researcher, I believe, but she basically reads for Phil these reviews that she got, actual reviews on a specific manuscript about women of color, perhaps. But basically, some of the reviewers, I don't know why there were 6 reviewers, but some of them were saying, you need to be comparing these faculty of color, women of color, to white individuals. How do we know that their experiences are valid or are different if we don't have the white individuals, right? And so she just teases it apart as to how problematic that is and how it upholds white supremacy and how they're operating from this dominant lens. But whenever I've gotten that feedback in qualitative, right? Well, how do we know these multiracial students are actually different from white students or from monoracial students? And I always refer to that article and I'm like, well, Christine Stanley says it doesn't matter. So...
Well, and I think a learning lesson for listeners who maybe don't even want to write journal articles, where I think many of us get a lot of this pushback. But even if you were doing evaluation and assessment quantitatively for your programs as a entry-level professional, you may see that same pushback there where you have a supervisor saying, well, why are you focusing in on either intersecting identities or one specific population without comparing it to the average or comparing it specifically to white students. Mm-hmm. And the same argument and response absolutely holds, that this is unique work, that all of the work that precedes this is largely hegemonic whiteness, genderism. And so the need for this, I think, across the board is so important.
Absolutely.
Definitely.
Even when we think about, like, one of the conversations that has come up amongst the research faculty at our campus is, thinking about this from a culturally proficient sort of viewpoint or a critical viewpoint, the language that we use, and you've sort of named this in terms of the power and sort of around this, but across all methodology, it doesn't matter what, when we always approach things from a problem, well, then that's also a problem. So, ultimately, if we keep trying to do that, then I think it's speaking to what sort of Jay's naming of, like, if we're always looking at it from a deficit approach, or what's wrong with this, why does this happen, then that ultimately is going to change and color the actual results or the actual study itself. And so I think the real power that the both of you are naming, and certainly what Jessica's naming as well, is centering who we need to be studying and doing that from a more appreciative inquiry standpoint and a more sort of culturally proficient standpoint is so important in the work. Again, I just think that that's so, I was going to say it's so underutilized and so not common in the field. But again, I think what you're offering is sort of hopefully a larger part of a movement that will be happening from other folks. So I'm excited about that.
I would also say that my passion for quant methods really grew out of survey design and instrumentation. And there's great power in having culturally relevant and community inclusive survey development techniques so that the questions that matter to the populations that you're studying are operationalized in your design. So in my LGBTQ data set, there are constructs related to identity disclosure and outness, or the number of queer and trans friends that you have, or how many queer and trans related student services resources you utilized. And those are largely the greatest indicators of healthy academic and social outcomes. And when you have an all population study, you don't have the privilege of asking those community specific measures. So I think for those interested in exploring different avenues to have community advocacy, survey development, survey review, and survey design is so critical.
Can I add on to that? Is that all right? So one of the things that is, I think, an asset of a quantitative approach that I never would have thought of going in relates to what Jay is saying, which is the sensitization process and how you disrupt normativity and alter what's perceived as quote unquote normal. Mm-hmm. And so when we started with MSL, we were told you absolutely cannot put any questions around transgender identification or sexual orientation on this study. No religious institutions will participate. Military institutions will not participate. You will get inaccurate data. It will ruin your survey. And from a value standpoint, we couldn't sit with that. So we put it in. And we had a few institutions that balked at it. We held our ground, and lo and behold, they did the survey anyways, right? Mm-hmm. The first data collection back in 2006 for our trans-identified participants, in the data that came back, about half of it was falsified. So we came up with a way to sort of triangulate and see, is this data falsified or accurate? Mm-hmm. And if you look at the 2009, 12, and 15 data, that percentage dropped disproportionately. And so we would have folks who would write in at the end of the questionnaire, why are you asking this? What is this liberal survey? We don't get that at all anymore. We have maybe 10% of the data that's falsified. And I'd like to believe that one of the things that happens is people see in a survey who they are represented, that race isn't this just categorical piece, but there's an identity salience piece to it as well. So we're not confounding racial identity with racial group membership. When you have ability statuses listed, religion broadly listed, sexual identity listed, gender identity, all of a sudden those from dominant populations start to see that that is and should be incorporated. And it reduces that taboo or non-normativity of it. And I'd like to think that over time, there is a indirect effect of really solid survey design that helps to also change the landscape of higher ed in terms of how people perceive.
Absolutely. Well, and I would also say, when I think back to my master's degree time at Maryland and thinking about reading research, or when we were going through sort of my statistics classes, the one thing that I always sort of was troubled by, I guess is the best way to put it, is when you're looking at identity groups, and then if you didn't get enough students who identified, and then they suddenly were erased, like their responses weren't included, there wasn't enough to do any tests or sort of statistical analyses with, and so they just were let go. And to me, from an ethical standpoint, that just troubled me so much, because ultimately it's, again, what you're naming earlier, a form of erasure, a form of power that's being enacted on others who, if you as a researcher are asking an individual to take your survey and then you don't do anything with that data, that is so problematic to me. And so again, I think what you're naming here in terms of the work that's sort of transpired of changing the ways in which research studies are done, especially quantitatively, and what you've been able to sort of do to highlight with some populations that we had never had information about. Like I think about the JCSD article, John, that you and Dawn and I forget your other co-author around trans folks, and they're like, I was like, that's amazing, because up to this point, there's been so little that we've been able to do. So I think that's been really a very interesting change to witness over the last sort of 10, 15 years.
Well, thank you for that. I mean, I would also say there's a responsibility as a white, queer, cisgender man that I have to also do that right. I think, that's a great example of an article that started in one form and was asked to be comparative in another. And it wouldn't have been published. And we had to make a decision around, well, is it more important to get it in the journal and start a movement, or is it more important to, I think, as a young researcher, I would do it differently now. I feel like I have more capital to be like, well, I'll take it elsewhere, right? But I think it's also emblematic of part of what I think Jay does super well with survey design, which I wish I could unpack how the wheels turn in your head, is how every question folds into every other question and how it has to constantly evolve. And so we don't use the same questions we did back then. If we had rested, to your point, Dan, if we had rested on, okay, well, those questions stand in 2005-06 and we're going to use them now in 2015, that would be equally as problematic because our consciousness around these concepts has evolved. And I think sometimes the idea is that quantitative is static and you don't want to change the survey because you want to see trends and you have to have the same indicators, when in reality it should be dynamic in that sense.
I'm loving this. Thank you for all of that. I really am learning a lot and starting to think through quant in different ways. Or at least approach it and look at it in different ways. So I'm going to jump around because I think this is a good time to ask. When you first started, John, you were just talking about this. So if you could maybe answer this question first. So thinking back to when you started learning about quantitative research and doing quantitative research, what has changed in terms of how you go about engaging in quantitative research from that time to now? And why has it changed?
So I'm stumbling here because I'm like, everything, all of it. I feel like, okay, so what hasn't changed maybe is my mindset, which is I don't really know what I'm doing, but I'm going to figure it out. I would say what hasn't, when you look at what has changed, I think I've become more proficient in survey design. I understand how technology interfaces, which I don't know that I was taught. So you can use quantitative research, integrate it technologically to reach populations you wouldn't have otherwise reached, get data you wouldn't otherwise have. And so I think the exciting piece now is when I started, we were just beginning to use, Karen Inglis really, I think, paved the way around online survey design, was doing that before Nessie or anyone even thought about that as an option. I certainly learned from her around that. But technology is moving even more quickly, and we have to be responsive to how the technology could inhibit our ability to have social justice embedded in what we're doing. So I get a lot of pressure around, well, it's harder to get completion. Well, I would rather have accessibility and I would rather have representation than completion. And so that changes the way you do the work. And so I have to sometimes let go of things that I would or wouldn't otherwise retain. And I feel more agency for that now. 10, 15 years ago, I felt like I had to follow the rules of quantitative research. So I'd read a textbook and it would say, you do it like this. And I'd be like, oh, I guess I have to do it like that. And I feel like, for those who are new, I would really encourage you not to repress your own insights or ideas of how to do quantitative research differently, because they may be spot on and no one else has ever thought of it before. And so I wish I would have maybe thought about that way in the past. My thinking around that has evolved. I think the other thing for me that is really different now is that I collect large scale data to do small scale work. Mm-hmm. Meaning the larger the data set, the more I can have representation and drill down. Mm-hmm. And the broad isn't as important to me, but I need the broad, because when I'm going in to make an argument to disrupt some power structure, I have to be able to articulate, here's the context in which this perceived as small data is nested in, and that changes the tone. So I think one thing that has changed for me is my ability to articulate the power of quantitative research, because I'm naturally a little hesitant about it. I've realized that I can use it in reverse sort of what is the argument I find problematic to be in favor of what I'm still doing in terms of advocacy work. Does that make sense?
Completely, yes.
I don't think they train you on how to use quantitative work for advocacy. They train you on how to find truth and how to give information. Mm-hmm. And so I feel like that was a learned skill or something I got through great colleagues who were really patient with me.
Thank you.
Yeah, I am reflecting because I'm only just finishing my 4th year as a faculty member, so I feel like I still have a lot of misconceptions that I haven't discovered yet. So it's a very humbling process to be a quantitative scholar. I think that in the past few years, I've learned a lot about intentional sampling techniques that can really inform, as Dan mentioned earlier, how to conduct analyses on populations that were historically excluded. Along that, I've learned the power of weighting and the importance of weighting your data sets, but it's kind of tricky with queer and trans folk because you can't weigh it because you don't know the actual population of people that you're surveying, so it becomes a little difficult in that regard. I've also learned what misconceptions that I had. I started off with my LGBTQ Alumnex survey thinking there's power in surveying queer and trans people, and there's power in narrating my community's experiences through survey design. And then a few years later, Nessie and Harry added it, and now the federal government next year will add sexual identity and trans identities to their high school longitudinal study of 2009 and their 3rd follow-up. And I'm starting to question if there is a broader conversation that needs to happen about the dangers of quantifying queer and trans people and what gate that is opening for other avenues that might come from that. So I don't know how currently, as survey designers, we can create fluidity and change in identity saliency and how people identify their social identities. But I think that is going to be on the horizon, a challenge that we're going to have to confront. And as John mentioned, a lot of the times as quant scholars, we have to be able to explore research longitudinally to analyze trends across time. Harry does this beautifully, of course. But when societal expectations or societal understanding of social identities change so quickly, for example, with trans people, how can we adapt and be nimble in our survey design so that our quantitative techniques keep up with the demands of communities that we're surveying? Mm-hmm. And I don't have the answers to those, and I'm interested in what's going to happen in the next 5 years, particularly with federal data collection on queer and trans people in particular, and also on undocumented student experiences and what implications that might have in a hostile administration in the White House, for example.
Jay brings up an excellent point. I think, with my qualitative study, I've never had someone come to me and be like, hey, can I have your qualitative data?
Mm-hmm.
And
Right.
it's so rich and it's so thick and there's so much of it. But with my quant data, people all the time are like, hey, can I use this? Can I use this? Can I use this? And something I never predicted was the need to protect how people then use, which I don't end up having to do with my qualitative data. With my quant data, I have to think if someone's asking for access to it, how are they going to position this? And I'll share a quick anecdote about this. I had a student who was incredibly well-attentioned from largely dominant identities, want to do a study around minoritized populations, wrote beautifully about what this was. I wasn't shepherding the process, but was on a committee for it. And when I saw the draft of the analysis, I was horrified. So the reality with quantitative research is if someone doesn't have an ethic of care around these justice issues, you can spin data in a whole lot of different ways. And not even just in a deficit perspective, but in a really damaging way. And so to suggest less representation, suggest less need for attention institutionally or structurally. And that's what happened with this project. And it was a huge aha for me that, particularly because of all of my dominant identities, I really needed to be much more protective before I shared data, because I was contributing to misrepresentation, and the inverse can happen. And I think the same thing happens on campuses. If someone is doing an evaluation, has a great survey, asks all sorts of questions demographically, you have to guard that data, because institutional agents could want to use it in ways that are not to advance the needs of those populations who have, in essence, by responding to your survey, entrusted you with the care of who they are and what they've disclosed.
Mm-hmm. For sure. And this moves us into sort of ethical issues that might be experienced. And certainly that's one that you named, John. Are there other ethical issues that you experience in terms of quantitative research that would be important to sort of think about and name for students?
Yes. Most of it's related to survey design. And as John can likely relate to, there's a lot of regret and heartache for survey design, because once your data are collected, the survey can't change. So there's a lot of, I have great interest in affective dimensions of survey design, and I can't wait to write a paper about this someday, about the emotional journey that I go through with developing a survey instrument, especially when it's about communities that I'm fully invested in. A small example is, in my data set, I had a question about ability that was defined by the ADA and if something affected a major life function. And I had a beautiful list of like 12 different, I think the federal government called it, abilities. And because I was studying queer and trans people, I wanted to also include immune deficiency, or people who were living with HIV or AIDS, to understand their unique narratives. And at the time, you know, I was singing in the Gay Men's Chorus of Washington, just had a friend pass away from complications related to AIDS. I was taking a pre-exposure prophylaxis drug, and like HIV and AIDS was a very salient theme in my life at that moment. And I had to cut the question down to, do you identify as having a life condition that majorly affects your functioning as a student? And had to eliminate all of the nuanced categories related to that. And it was such an emotional and ethical, visceral response for me to have to essentially eliminate the narrative of living with HIV and AIDS, particularly for queer people, because of survey fatigue and having to prioritize what was important on the survey. And it is really, really difficult when you have to cut a survey in half that you're developing, because you don't want to tax your participants too much, or you have to be realistic that someone won't respond to something that takes 20 minutes long, which essentially means you have to eliminate an important narrative that you think is relevant to someone's story. And it can be heartaching.
Yeah, that is, I will just, yep. I mean, for me, because there is breadth, it's that question of breadth versus depth. And the other piece is that ethically, you can include things that are really important to you, but then if the data is inaccurate because of fatigue, even if someone completes it, then you don't have accurate data and you're misrepresenting. Mm-hmm. And so I feel that dilemma all the time as well around what you choose to include, what you don't. I think ethically, there are some questions for me around, so let me give you maybe 3 examples. One would be in the MSL, I would like to just have open-ended, how do you identify in terms of race? How do you identify in terms of gender? How do you identify in terms of sexual orientation? 2 issues arise from that. In some cases, for me, I can't because the breadth, how many institutions are participating and how quickly we have to turn around reports that schools are paying for. And to have an open-ended question, I would have to go in and code hundreds of thousands with such speed that I would be scared I would ethically miss things, right? And so I have to trade off constantly around that. I think now the benefit of that is that educative process when it's open-ended and not closed categories, you do sensitize others to options that they may not have even known. But I think that's a trade-off. I think a huge ethical issue on the analysis side for me comes with the failure to use effect sizes. So if you're listening and you haven't heard that term, we typically talk about, is there a difference, let's say, between 2 populations based on significance? So beyond the probability of chance, are there differences and scores on 2 different groups of students? Effect size allows us to look at what's the practical meaningfulness, what's the magnitude of that difference. So if you have a sample like an MSL that is huge, you're going to find differences everywhere just because you have so many people. If you have a really, really tiny sample, you're not going to find really important differences because there's not enough people in it. And so the use of effect size help us to understand the practical value and the magnitude of those differences. And so ethically, I'm challenged by journals who do not demand the use of effect sizes when they know that simple significance testing often has misrepresentation of data, either saying something significant or not. And I'm challenged by our unwillingness to sort of take that extra step when it would open up the door to small sample research in ways that would be really powerful. And then I think the last thing I would just share is that, going back to survey design, you have to think about who your audience is. So if you're at an institution that's incredibly conservative, we have very conservative institutions that participate in MSL, you have to think about what's the ramification of asking someone to disclose something. So for example, if an institution has in their honor code that it is illegal to identify as queer, and you ask that question, you have essentially given institutional agents the ability to identify someone if they track. And that goes for large-scale research as well as your independent evaluation projects that you might do. So you really have to understand the context in which you're asking to understand the ethics. So they're not universal. They're really specific to where you are. Mm-hmm. I remember before Don't Ask, Don't Tell, we had 3 institutions that were military institutions that were livid with us, that we would not give them or ask data about sexual orientation and sexual identity. And we simply wouldn't, because it would have put respondents at risk when those institutions had that data.
Mm-hmm.
So interesting stuff that I've never thought of. Thank you. So I'm going to jump to one of the last questions. And I'm wondering, for you doing quantitative research, what do the terms validity and reliability mean to you? Why don't we start with you, Jay?
Sure. Validity is, are you measuring what you're purporting to measure? And reliability is, if you were to do this study over again, would you get similar findings? I think that's boiled down as simple as I can think about it.
Go ahead, Jessica.
Can you give us an example? So perhaps maybe in your dissertation? Or anything?
Yes. So I look up to Sylvia Hurtado's work with campus climate that she and others at UCLA have been doing for decades. I also look up to Sue Rankin and her work on queer and trans campus climate that she has been doing for decades. The way they operationalize campus climate is very different. And it's partially because Sylvia developed constructs that were centered on race and racism, and Sue developed constructs that were centered on sexuality and trans folk. And so if someone was to look at those different constructs, one might call them something different. So if someone was to look at Sylvia's original constructs, they might call it racial campus climate, whereas others might call it campus climate. And that is something that we would call construct or face validity, is what we're actually measuring, yielding what we are hoping that it would measure. And so there's great intentionality needed with being really articulate and responsive to community needs about how you construct factor items, for example, and the definitions and labels that accompany those. One way of getting at that is by using content experts to review your constructs. And in addition to using researchers and student affairs professionals, there's also great value in using people who identify with the community that you are studying to analyze your constructs. When I think about validity, I think about whether we're being specific enough in the constructs related to identity. And it gets into this huge thought like, okay, so within Harry, should they have a construct that is campus climate? Or should we have several different constructs that is campus climate regarding gender, campus climate regarding country of origin, campus climate regarding ability status? And I don't know, I think there's good approaches for both and limitations for both, but it's not something that's often discussed in survey development.
That is a beautiful explanation. I would add one layer to that around socialization. So we are all making meaning in this context of domination. And the reality is how someone interprets, just like Jay said, could look different. But let's use this example. If I tell one of my friends here in the United States, meet me at the football field, they are probably going to go to like a pigskin football, NFL, and I can't believe I'm using a sports analogy because I know nothing about it. So if anyone's listening and this is wrong, I apologize. I literally know nothing about sports, but I'm trying to envision this in my head, okay? So they would probably show up at like the NFL stadium, right? If I am in Europe at my family's home in Spain with my Spanish family, I said, meet me at the football field. I might end up at the NFL field and they would end up at a soccer stadium because the social construction of the concept itself is different. And we always, in quantitative research, always, it's like my pet peeve, do this convenient sidestep into international differences in construct validity versus acknowledging the depth of domestic cultural differences here in the United States, which alleviates any responsibility for looking at race, ethnicity, gender, sexual identity, ability status, socioeconomic status. There's a presumption that there is inherent validity, which is simply a form of hegemony. Mm-hmm. Same thing holds for reliability. Just because a scale is reliable for my folk as white people doesn't mean it's going to be reliable for someone who's taking the scale who is African American or Black or Latinx or Indigenous. And so we have to do a better job in quantitative research of understanding the nuance, as Jay suggested, and then understanding the cultural contingency domestically and internationally of what we're doing. Mm-hmm. And remembering that just because, I get manuscripts all the time where they're like, well, it's reliable in this study. And I'm like, you're using it with a totally different population. How do you know it's reliable for this group? I need to see some evidence of that beyond a reliability alpha coefficient. Mm-hmm. And so I think that becomes really important to me.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. I think that speaks to, in the qual panel, I think it was the qual panel recording, I shared like one of my soapbox issues is as a qual researcher, when I don't see students or other colleagues who sort of talk about a positionality statement and how they're reflexive in their work, it bothers me, right? Like that's like, we need to be doing that. But I also think the absence of that among quantitative researchers is astounding as well. So, I think what you're naming is our identities and how we're who we are playing a role in very nuanced ways in how we're then framing out the story that we're telling through our research and the findings that we're writing up. And yet, for whatever reason, history and privileging has sort of centered that around a qualitative perspective and not necessarily as much from a quantitative perspective, which I always find troubling and interesting at the same time.
Can I ask you all a question? So I've often wondered, is this because people are afraid? So the absence of a positionality statement in quantitative research, is this because of conditioning of how we've been trained as researchers? Or is it because people are afraid to acknowledge that their quantitative research might be wrong 5 years later? Or who they are? I mean, I think most folks hopefully know that the bias is coming in anyways. I can't figure out, what do you think that's about? Is it a fear of vulnerability? Is it conditioning? Is it?
I mean, I think it's both. I think it's all of the above, right? I think what you named earlier, right, around qualitative research or quantitative research, I think being full of power and hegemony, right? Like that, then how it gets translated and sort of socialized in terms of instruction, there is largely a hierarchy, whether we want to believe it or not, and whether we agree with it or not is different, but like of people at face value taking statistics and saying, well, that's a statistic and that's always right, rather than a qualitative measure being, well, that's someone's interpretation of that story. It's, I think there is this sort of notion within us that, well, you can't manipulate numbers. Well, now in the age of fake news, I guess, or whatever. But, I think that to me is sort of how that goes in. But I think the point about, 5 years down the line, am I going to be proved incorrect? I think is a huge piece of it too. I mean, I think it's sort of wrapped in ego.
I think post-positivism embodies perceived objectivity. So it's an assumption that we don't have to articulate our positionality because we're purported to be completely objective with the data. I think that and then from a manuscript submission perspective, I'm often told by reviewers to cut my positionality statement because I need to operationalize my variables or describe my analytical process more. So it's difficult. It's really tricky.
Yeah. Absolutely. And even in qualitative work, right? Like,
Right.
you need to cut this down. Like it doesn't, this is fine for a dissertation, but really you shouldn't be putting it in here. And I'm like,
Right.
Anyway, all right. So we're going to move to our final question because we could just keep talking about that for a long time. And so as our students begin working around quantitative research in educational contexts, what advice might you give them to think about in terms of doing their own work on master's theses or even projects down the line that might be actually much more assessment, evaluation, sort of practice-oriented projects? And whoever would like to go first can go.
There's great power in being able to utilize numbers to advocate alongside communities. And I found the most meaning as a researcher when I aggressively pursued education about as many quant methods as I possibly could. And I think that's true for any methodological training. I advocate for master's students, doctoral students, student affairs professionals to train themselves on different methodological techniques because it will only serve you well. I would also say that there is great power placed in quantitative inquiry with decision making, particularly with resource allocation and policy reform. And I encourage folks to be adaptive to rather than dismissive of quantitative techniques. We spend an hour articulating the limitations of quantitative designs. and we all recognize those. And now we can be good stewards of student data through survey design to look beyond the limitations to explore how can it benefit students' experiences and outcomes.
Ditto to all of that, and I would say that there is an ethical, if not moral, imperative that individuals learn how to be critical consumers of quantitative research. Not everyone has to do it. And, at some level, you don't even have to enjoy doing it, but you have to learn how to interpret it. Otherwise, there is a power dynamic that occurs around knowledge construction, around, as Jay said, policy and decision-making. And so minimally, I hope you embrace that you need to be a critical consumer of this work. And then I would also just add that as you're going through your educational experience, never to let anyone tell you that it's too hard to understand, that there's not enough time to explain it, or it's not covered or important. Because those are all ways to, I think, decrease your efficacy and agency. And it's about the person who's in the front of the room at the moment, not about you. And so as best as possible when you're in environments, don't internalize that, because you can learn it. We all have, and it's possible. And it's actually incredibly validating and liberating to figure out how you can use it instead of quantitative research using you. So, I think that is the most important piece. There are so many students who I know who come in who are like, I could never do it because I'm not smart enough. You are absolutely smart enough. The system doesn't want people to learn it to the extent that they can be adept with it. So to stay in process as much as possible and find those good folks who will coach and mentor around it.
Mm.
That is wonderful advice to leave on. Thank you so much to both of you for joining us and to spend your time today sharing your insights. I know I speak for Dr. Harris and myself. I know that our students are really going to take a lot out of this, and I know that we ourselves have learned a lot over this last hour. So thank you so much for all that you've given to us today.
Thank you.
Thank you.